polycentric circles, which are kind of called nodes as well. So a thing like Rosebank would be a metropolitan node. A thing like in the city would be a node. So there are these various priority areas in which they're focusing their attentions and their money, supposedly. Now, that notion, that vision, formed the basis of the Spatial Development Framework, which is meant to have been devised in terms of the legal requirements of the Spatial Development and Planning Act, Land Use Management Act, the SPLUMA. It doesn't really match that act. It's very much become a policy plan used by the council to direct its thinking and responses to applications made by individual applicants, and also when it itself is involved, doesn't have a huge regard for what the spatial policy plan says, because there's a lot of encouragement of development such as Diepsloot, areas down in Nodal, etc. So there's a kind of odd lack of obedience to their plan, which they said is going to solve all of our problems and create effectively walkable zones rather than car-orientated zones. So they created this in 2016, which is the survey which Roby referred to. And they've had, subsequently, they've introduced a thing called the Nodal Review. Now, the Nodal Review was to say, let's have a look at these little zones which we decided should be expanded and developed further because of the efficiencies of using the already existing infrastructure and proximity and accessibility. And we will do a revision of the boundaries of those nodes. So an area like Rosebank, which was quite small, probably 100 odd hectares, they've looked at that and now they've applied these hexagons. Now the hexagons are based on walkability. They're about 10 hectares each. And they've done an analysis of these hexagons to say, are you close to roads? Have you got good accessibility? Are you close to existing? This is all existing stuff. Are you close to existing schools? Are you close to parks, etc.? Can you walk there within a few minutes? So the hexagons are about 400 meters across. And they work out to 10 hectares a shot. And they've used this to dictate their preferences as to how many people could live in a particular area. So this is overlaid across the city, and you end up with a kind of profile of dense development petering out towards the edges, where people are have less access to facilities, infrastructure, etc. So the Nodal Review has been adopted, and it has a set of SDF, the Spatial Development Framework, had a set of controls, and it had very few zones. It had, I think, 3 zones. One was the zone which is external to the urban area, outside the urban development boundary. That's the green one. That was about 20% of the city area. And those were the areas where they were not encouraging any development, mainly reserved for ecological, environmental, and agricultural purposes. The orange one, which you can see is the dominant color in the map, is the consolidation zone. And then the blue one is, I think, probably to do with the transformation zone, where they really wanted things to happen. So those are the 3 zones. Now,
maybe I'll just for everybody. This is where we are at the moment.
Okay, yeah.
This is the centre of Joburg, and this is the M1 going out to Pretoria, and this is the ring road. Just to give everybody going. Okay.
So the blue blobs are really areas where they hope to do a great deal, encourage densification, encourage improvement of the area, etc. So with the Nodal Review, they've taken a different approach. We still have the areas which are excluded, but they've now got 7 zones. And they're called transect zones. Transect planning is a new kind of fangled thing, where the idea is to focus a lot on the built form of the outcome as opposed to the land use, which used to be the old development control style. And each of these hexagons is now allocated a transect zone, and it's allocated a density which is indicative of what kind of density or intensity of development you can get in the particular hexagon. So these attributes are then converted into a set of guideline tables. So there are guideline tables which give you an idea of how dense the area can be, what the coverage of the buildings could be, what the footprint could look like, the aspects you need to take into account, and the mix of land uses which you can get as well. So that's a very important component. All of these little zones are made subject to available infrastructure, which is water, lights, etc., and heritage constraints, and the other ones, environmental constraints. So there's a caveat on all of this because it's not really addressed in the nodal review. So you have a potential development picture put to you, but it is subject to all of these things being in place to sustain your intended development. And it's very much a reactive kind of planning, in that the main response is to individual applications made by private parties, and so you get a response. They would look at the nodal review plan and say, okay, you can have 60 dwelling units a hectare, etc. If you can show that you can get access to water, sanitation, etc., then you will get a support from the council because they view it as almost regulatory. It's almost like a prescription. So I think it should be much more than that. It has aligned to it a set of urban design controls, which are not really looked at because they're rather awkwardly written. So I think they're inaccessible and hard to administer. And as a result, people just look at the one set of charts about what you can get, and they don't look at the set of charts which say what you have to do to get there. So that's an issue. So anyway, so that's the background to the spatial framework, and then augmented by this nodal review. Now the council has advertised for interested parties to make comments on the new spatial development framework, which is an update of the old one. It retains all of the elements of the old one. It still talks about the orange zone, which is the consolidation zone, the blue zone, transformation zone, and the green zone. So those are consistently applied, and then they have another set of maps and rules. They've got one set of rules in the SDF, and then another set of rules which are on the nodal review, which say rather different things. In practice, what the council does is it uses the nodal review guidelines and indications of density, residential density, etc., as a prescriptive kind of indicator of what you may get or what you will get, in fact, if you've got the services. So you've got this plan which has got two styles of planning. This SDF is a combination of two styles of planning, and it's actually very hard to fathom, even for the council officials, it would seem, because they immediately go to the nodal review and read out what the answer is. And it often has very little contact with the reality of the area, very little knowledge of the areas expressed. The plans do not have much input from either the communities who are affected by them, or in fact from very sectoral aspects. So people like Johannesburg Road, Joburg Water, etc., have seemingly had very little input to these plans and the potential which is allocated by the nodal review. So that's a bit of an issue.
Maybe you could go into the urban development boundary.
Okay. So what Rosemary's pointed out is there are certain areas which have been allocated as green areas, which are meant to be retained in perpetuity for the benefit of the city, because otherwise it's really in line with the idea of compact cities. You create these compact areas, and then you are able to retain the more pristine areas in perpetuity to the benefit of the city and the surrounding neighbours, and generally for good urban management. So, okay. So this one is the one which came out of the SDF, the Spatial Development Framework, and that one is a replication. That's the nodal version of this.
For our region, we're region
For your
A.
particular region, which is region A, yes. So you can see they have retained, look at the two big green blobs, they have retained those, and
this area here is that the Charleswell, North Cadoc area. This is Deep Sturt, and this is Kyalami. Here's Summit Road, here's Main Road, R55, and then coming down this road here is the other main road going past Lone Hill and into the ring road, which runs something like that.
The other aspect which you would see from that plan is a defined outline of the nodes. The mid-round node is that long skinny job which basically follows the M1. And there are other nodes in the area which are areas where a wider range of land uses and high intensity land uses are encouraged by the council. One of the components of the plan is, one of the legal requirements of the plan is that it's meant to serve to integrate the various levels of government. So certain competencies are allocated to people like the province, and others are allocated to municipalities, others are national. And you're meant to try and pile these things together and get a coherent plan out of them. So one of the things in your area is the PWB road system, which dates back to 1975, and it was created with a view to, I don't know, but it was very American plan, and it was spread out suburbia everywhere, and as long as you had a car, you were okay. So it's fallen on hard times in terms of implementation. I think the costs associated with it, and I think the nature of the organisation, which is the Provincial Roads Department, has somewhat lost its momentum. And as a result, you have these roads depicted on plans, but they're not real roads, and unlikely to be for a long time. But they do define areas, even though they are ghost roads, and they always have a threat of, suddenly being implemented one day when things perk up and people get more cars. So it is quite a divisive thing. They are usually very wide road reserves, so usually 60, 70 meters across, particularly these grey ones, this would be the PWD. That's 9, and this is the 5. So you end up with these tracts of land with nothing much can happen in them because they're protected by a law. A provincial law, they introduced a law to make sure that their road network wasn't destroyed by allocating rights in those areas. So it has a legal protection, so any person wanting to apply along or near one of these routes has to take that route into account as though it was existed. So there are building rights applicable to them, and as I say, the reserves themselves are very sizable and have to be left out of any development which might be intended in the area. Anyway, the point here is really that it does rather cut it up into quadrants, and it does, in all likelihood, impact on things like the environmental outside urban development boundary areas. Now, day glow here.
I think
Okay.
also the move, and I won't be able to speak by the term because we have nobody here to verify, but the move also is towards more public transport and train type transport rather than road.
Yeah. So that's really the underpinning notion of the nodal review is walkability. That's why these things have chosen to be 400 meters in extent, etc. So the idea is to move away from cars to have a diverse mix of uses within walking distance of your house.
And also compact development.
Which
so
requires
that,
compaction.
Yeah, which requires compaction. And the city have already said, Steve, you you can verify the figures, but they've already said that how the nodal review and the current policy for the city will contain growth for the city for the next how many years did they say? It was something like that. It was quite remarkable. At least another 30 years. So you can just anticipate that the urban areas are going to become more and more condensed with development.
Yes, if there are services to sustain that density, which brings me to another thing. So the spatial plan, the spatial development framework, which has been out for comment, and the nodal review are now being brought together into this updated document. But they still retain their independence and their different styles of planning, which makes them very awkward to read, because the one says this is how we're doing it, the other one says something different. So what I've written a few little comments on, but one of the things which might be a good idea is to get them to integrate these two and to in fact allow the dominant plan, which is the nodal review, to be the plan, as opposed to the variety of plans which you see on the wall in front of you. You know, take away the consolidation zone. It has in fact fallen away by practice and it's been replaced by a number of other zones, which I said there's 7 of it. But it's generally things like the nodes, general urban zone, suburban zone, and a few other variants. So the plan is rather fractured at the moment. Now, the other things which they have included in the update, so you've got the plan, and then you've got the nodal review as an annexure to it. And then they also deal with things like inclusionary housing. They deal with a thing called Precinct Plan making, if you like, which is a very vital part of things. It was always part of a hierarchy of plans for addressing particular local circumstances. So the idea was that you have a general spatial vision, which is the SDF, the Spatial Development Framework, or the nodal review, and then you'd look at the particular characteristics of an area, such as Baloo or whatever, and you would take those general guidelines into account, but you would then apply them to what the reality of the area is in terms of its servicing, its size of properties, its proximity to services, etc. So you try and create a locally applicable plan. The Precinct Plan manual, as I've said, the SDF is not very compliant with this Pluma Act, because it's very prescriptive about what you have to do, how you measure performance in your plan, etc. None of those things are done. When it gets to precinct plans, the council has no capacity to do those. It's done 1 or 2 for the corridors of freedom, it's done things for the inner city, but in general, it's not interested or able to address local needs. So it doesn't do them. And it uses the generic guidelines as its go-to assessment tool. Now, precinct plans, if you've got the money to do them, you can try. But the problem is that they are also beholden to the overall guidelines, and the council and its particular section which deals with spatial planning and city transformation is very averse to any deviation from those generic principles. So you are a bit stuck, because generally people are a bit more realistic living in the area about what could happen there and what could build up a nice area, maybe a denser area, but at least it would be something that people are familiar with the prospects, and they understand, if they buy into an area, what the plan is for that particular area. So that is what the role of precinct plan could fulfill, but it is, let's say, an expensive thing, because they will require you to do investigations into traffic, environmental aspects, heritage, etc., in order to justify your modification to their general guidelines for development. A precinct plan is therefore constrained. So if you're in the green area, there's no point in really doing one other than, as Rosemary referred to, which is kind of like a local community plan. You won't get the council to approve it, because it's already determined that you can't do development in that area of any magnitude. So it's a very, it starts off, what is the zone? And it's basically a no. But if you were to get into an area like Melrose, where they've now, their little orange zone is now being expanded or taken away and been substituted with a metropolitan node. In that instance, you would be able to get a precinct plan quite easily, provided it meets the, as I say, the generic intentions of the development plan, the council's ideas about what the guidelines, etc., for that area should be. So the best you can do then is talk about widening sidewalks and things like that, maybe retaining a few trees, because the other is already predetermined in terms of the guidelines. So, yeah.
As we've been told by the council, relative to doing a precinct plan, certainly for and I'll, if John doesn't mind, John, the chairperson is sitting here, for the Baloo area, the city clearly said that where our area is already protected to be an agricultural area of low density, so a precinct plan wouldn't be appropriate. The city have said that if they have to, and I'm sure our council can add to this, if they have to start approving moving of an urban development boundary and approve, which you would have to do to approve a precinct plan, they change the zoning, the city would go bankrupt. In most cities anywhere in the world, you have green zones, and those green zones really are your areas of wetlands and grasslands and areas that retain some level of environmental interest for the community. And unfortunately, I'll just touch briefly on it, that there is a presidential plan which develops this area here going all the way up to Lanseria Airport, and this is now unlikely to remain a green zone in the future. The city have said that this will be developed if the various provinces who are part of this, which is the West, Northwest, City of Joburg and Tshwane, if they can all guarantee the infrastructure for that future development, then the city will start approving developments in that area. So that area, if it ever happens, is all, for all intents and purposes, for the whole north of the city, that area will be gone. So it really does just leave this area. So the city and this little stretch here, which is in Krugersdorp, so the city is quite concerned about retaining that long term.
Just one last thing. I probably got you all bored silly by now, but there's the policy plan and then there's the regulatory set of documents. So once the policy has been used to determine an application, it gets recorded in the town planning scheme. And the process is through the planning bylaws. So the bylaws tell you how to do it, and then at the end of the day, the rights which you've acquired are then recorded in the town planning scheme. And that's also needs some revision, because if we take the green area, then there are contradictions between the guidelines and the zoning guidelines in the scheme. Things like that need to be attended to, and I think Rosie's asked me to write a few notes about the applicability of the spatial framework, what needs to be changed in it to align the policy and the zoning insofar as it's possible. So that will be something which comments will be delivered on. But yeah, so you've got zoning, you've got the way to do the zoning, and then you've got the policies in the background which give you the guidance as to what you might ask for.
Steve,
So,
can I
I was going to say, Steve, thank you for that. Maybe we should move on to questions. So, John, please go.
So I'm John Evans. I'm the chairman of Baloo. and we're in the dark. But
Sounds like a planner's.
Generator person, please.
yeah, I'm assuming you can hear me.
Yes.
So my thought around precinct plan was not to facilitate development, but rather protect against. You know, and I know we're in the green zone. I mean, if we presented either as blue or the broader area, a precinct plan that was an equestrian-focused precinct plan around sidewalks being horse-friendly and trails and various things. I mean, and trying to entrench our rights even further, because I don't trust the city to abide by its rules.
Exactly right.
Is that something you think could be explored?
Yes, look, I think if you do nothing, you're not going to alter anything. Even if you win over the people who reside in the area or give them a degree of certainty about the future intentions for the area, I think that's the benefit of, let's say, a community-style precinct plan. If you wanted to go and get the council's endorsement to that, they view it as a very low priority thing. They'll say they have already depicted the environmental sensitivities in the area. It's really not an area they want to focus any attention to. So they're unlikely to do it. But if you follow the precepts or the prescriptions for the precinct plan, it will cost a lot of money because you have to do proper traffic studies, you have to do environmental studies, you have to do a number of things to make it compliant with the SCLUMA requirements for such a plan.
And then it might sit there for many years.
Yes, and then it falls away after 5 years. So, you know, this plan, which they're updating at the moment, it's reached 5 years. And now they're saying they should renew it in order to keep it as a valid spatial framework.
The purpose of doing the management plan rather than the precinct plan, and that was on the advice of the city and of transformational planning who run this whole show. It was as a guideline not only for residents but also for officials within the city, because I hope we don't have any city spies here. David shush. But we do have, we're always getting new planners in development planning, and not all of them are that au fait with particular things happening in particular areas. So if this becomes a tool for those officials to also be able to at least be guided by, I think it would certainly help a huge lot, and the city felt that way as well. Apart from residents who buy in the city, in the area, you know, it would also help estate agents and people like that.
I think what I've tried to do with that is try to take all the elements which are particular and pertinent to the policy ones, and then deal with the other aspects such as the land use planning, the land use scheme, things like that. So it's a bit more coherent. Well, I write in a very kind of dense way, but probably has to do with my lack of intellect. But that it's trying to take the stuff out of the general bundle of stuff and make it applicable to the particular area it's going to serve. So it should facilitate an understanding and also an interpretation which is beneficial to the area.
Yeah, you see, I mean, my big concern is creep. I mean, and you know, the primary school is an example. It's creeping and growing bigger slowly, and how do we protect against that? Because
well, there, you're quite right, and we're not the only area subject to that wish for creep by certain segments of our community, and the city will address those in tribunals. So it's important to have this tool, but it's also important to not fall into apathy. I know a number of us get fairly dejected because, for example, what John's talking about, we had the recent tribunal. I was the only resident who was there to voice the objection of the residents. And I'm a town planner, so I know what's going on, and I can do that. But wow, it would make such a difference if the city got the message that a number of residents have placed their objections, and they are there to be seen and to be heard. I think that would also help in stopping the creep, because certain developers are sitting, or their representatives are sitting in front of these town planners in the city of Joburg every single week. We aren't. We're all busy. We're earning money. We don't have the time to do that. That's their job. They can think day or night, and they can sit in front of those development planners every single week. And unfortunately, they can also feed misinformation. So the development planners think they're doing what the community wants. It's not true in many cases. So it's important that we stop the apathy that I'm afraid does occur through all the areas, and hoping somebody smart in the city will make the right decision. It's not going to happen unless
But how do we use the rules to try and strengthen our position so that we don't have to turn up on that?
Good. I'll just give you an idea of how the city works. As I said, it's very reactive to applications. So if they are seen to comply with a set of guidelines, planner will write a positive report. It goes to a municipal tribunal with a recommendation saying it's great. The tribunal...
And sorry to interrupt there. Out of the last 200 tribunals, 2 said it wasn't great. The rest, they were all great.
So the tribunal is comprised of the very same people who wrote the report. It's hard to get objectivity into the equation. So what they read in this policy guideline is very important in determining this, because the tribunal is, in terms of Spooner, beholden to uphold the provisions of the Spatial Development Framework. So there is an argument which says that the spatial framework is not, in fact, a compliant and real spatial development framework. But anyway, the point is that there is no outside authorities adjudicating these things. It's like an echo chamber. You get the stuff in, goes to the same bunch who probably pre-decided or agreed that that's the positive recommendation which has to be there. Your only option after that is go on appeal, and you've got the same effect, because it's not a personal appeal, it's not an oral presentation, it's usually a written one, and it goes to the MMC for planning, who signs it off on the advice of the people who made the recommendation before. So that is a real challenge, because I think Rosemary's figures are probably quite accurate that in the city I don't think there's been many successful appeals, other than when there's been a technical mishap, or they've obviously not done something correctly, or they've misaligned something or so, or you know. So it's really not in favour of an objective outcome, and that's, so if you can clarify the content in the assessment, if you can say, look, it's set out here, you don't have to read 3 books to get to it, it's kind of condensed into this. Hopefully that will assist in getting to the right outcome. And maybe things which deal with the services, all of those things are integrated with that approach.
It's a tough ask, John, to try and get.
Try and further entrench our rights.
Yeah, I mean, our rights are sacrosanct in terms of the policy and in terms of agricultural legislation and all the rest of it, but they do get overridden by officials who are not au fait with the regulations and what's going on in the area. So it's important that we get community involvement as well.
Rose or Steve, if you don't mind. From what I've heard, my understanding is that this management plan has no legal authority.
Yeah.
Does the spatial plan have any legal authority?
In terms of the spatial planning land use management act, the SPLUMA thing, all decisions taken by the municipality have to be in line with the policy. And because they are so wide, you know, in Rosebank, application for 1,000 dwelling units a hectare, it says a minimum of 60. So it's still within that what it says, and those will be supported. Yeah, so it is a problem because it doesn't really confine you in any way. But if it was a proper spatial development framework, it would be linked to the services capacity of the area, the traffic aspects, where you're going to place your next open space. There's no forward planning in this thing at all. It doesn't say where the next school is going to come. So in Rosebank, if it's 500 hectares, and a lot of the applications are for 500 units, dwelling units per hectare. So 500, there's quite a few households. And if you use the CSR standards for provision of open space or of new schooling or public facilities, you end up with in theory, you end up with a few skinny little buildings and a lot of open space around them. Because the space demands of those things in South Africa, it is, I suppose. New York's a bit different, they stick you into a building or something, but yeah, it would gobble up all your space. But those numbers are quite hairy, considering that much of the infrastructure which has been created in the area is really dated. It's maybe the core little area was fine, but it's now spread. It goes into the whole of Melrose, the whole of Dunkeld, all the way Park down north, so it's a massive area, and those will all be supported, but because of that prescription in the Spooner Act. But the argument is that in fact is the Nodal review and are these things in fact spatial development frameworks as required in the Act, and it seems like they. Yeah, the council is it's allowed to do any form of municipal planning it wants. That's its competency. So it can call them policies or whatever, but it doesn't have that legal, it has the backing of the council, but it doesn't have that legal requirement for compliance. It's more a guideline if it's a policy plan.
And also, I think just to add to a bit of the confusion between council, I won't say council departments, but separate businesses that all serve the council. And for example, Joburg Water putting infrastructure through this area in parts where the spatial development framework specifically states no infrastructure. And Joburg Roads Agency have a Northern Areas Road Plan, which has never gone through public participation. But they've already done planning in this area for future roads, and the spatial development plan specifically states infrastructure will not be supported. So there are those confusing aspects from other departments, which everybody regards as City of Joburg, even though they're separate companies.
Is there any more planning for the car train? Because at one stage they said there was going to be a car train running from Blue Hills through to, I think, Randburg and then Lansera.
Well, you see, that adds to it, Helen, because yes, there is car train planning, but it's never been incorporated in the city's spatial planning as such. But yes, car train are doing their own thing.
Steve, I've got two questions. One relates to the ease with which developers seem to convert land that has been zoned as residential and convert it to something else. That seems to be done relatively easily by developers. And then the second question I've got relates to communication in terms of when these changes are being applied for or being made. Rosemary, you mentioned at that tribunal, you were the only attendee. Sometimes it's just a communication thing of getting that information to as many people as possible. So I suppose there's three questions there, if you don't mind, Rosemary.
You're going to repeat them slowly.
So the first one was that
why do I get the rights?
the first one is how quickly you can change rights from residential to commercial or residential to something else.
Well, it's not that quick. It takes about a year for a normal rezoning, which is aligned to the policy kind of guidelines. So it would take that. Into that part, you'd have to address the aspects of traffic, available infrastructure, etc. So it's all reaction to your application, but that normally is put together in a few months, and then it goes to the tribunal if there are objections for consideration. If it's aligned with the policy and there are no objections from the sectoral departments, the Joburg Roads, etc., then an official can approve the increase in rights. Yeah, then the only thing which puts people off it a bit is that there are development contributions which have to be paid, and in the case of residential densities, you have to pay for open space for those. It's quite a big number, which is never used, of course, for that purpose, but it becomes a bit of a constraint on the density you ask for. Insofar as the notification of people is concerned, there's a prescription in the bylaw which says what you have to do to notify joining neighbours, put a sign on the property, put it in the newspapers and in the Provincial Gazette, which most people don't read Provincial Gazette because it's not exactly riveting stuff. But as a result, if you do those things, you have to then say you have done it, you've notified all the most directly affected parties and things, and you put it in the Gazette and you put it on the property, etc. Then that's deemed adequate notice. Once it's in the council's hands and they're aware of your objection, then they will notify you should there be a hearing to discuss this. And they've been doing a lot of virtual hearings of late, so they will just send you a link and say your bit.
And Steve is talking about a best case scenario.
Yeah, I think so.
Because the person who used to run that communication system within the council retired, and there is, I know certainly on a couple of the recent tribunals, a number of missing objections where people haven't been notified. So I think when you do put in an objection to something, please notify, for example, you're in the conflict, please ask people to notify or copy their objection also to the chairperson or the admin person so that they can at least follow up. Because I know certainly in Bolu, we don't know who has objected. The people who have notified the admin or the board or whatever, they would have been notified by me or the town planner, and they would have known about the tribunal. But people who have objected and they've just dropped off, they would never have been notified by the tribunal. In fact, we've had the recent tribunal cancelled 3 times because people weren't sufficiently notified. So at the moment it is a bit of a mess, and so things will easily slip through currently, unfortunately. But also just related to your area, what we found is that having an official from the department that created these plans and created the policies saved a density issue which would have been worse in your area if that person hadn't have been at the tribunal and insisted on a lower density. So that's quite useful to know.
Thank you, that is very useful. Because I've got 2 examples, one in Santon, building next door to one of my properties, is a 900-bedroom high-rise building. We were not approached as the next door neighbour.
Wow.
And then the example that came up, we're in Kyalami Crest, and there's a garage that's been proposed on the corner of Wiskin and Ethel, and there was no direct notification to us, again as a next door neighbour.
You see, there is provision for an intervener application, which is when you do become aware of it. The trouble is people do become aware and they don't respond, so you've got 7 days from the time you become aware of it. But you can go backwards, I suppose, but it does cost money and you have to go to court and things like that.
And it just talks to your point about how do you stop the creep, and it's you seem to lose one property at a time.
Yes.
You don't suddenly lose 10 or 20.
You actually lose a lot more because what happens is with this, because it's not prioritised and it's not planned, it happens in the most unfortunate of places. It creates a void or an allergy to the place, and it's around the whole thing. So you might have one stand which is going for a lot of units or whatever, but around it there's a whole lot of apprehension, and people aren't really that bowled over by having this. In Sandhurst area, they generally knock down the buildings, or else they leave them to become derelict and they then get occupied and become an even worse hazard. But the derelict buildings is also not great to have vacant patches of land in a desirable area, which soon becomes undesirable.
Yeah.
But I don't know how to do it. What I've been doing for some residents is just keeping track of the provincial gazettes and saying, look, here's something, you want to do something or whatever. But it's very hard to do more than that because getting access to the application is difficult. The council systems, as Rosemary said, are pretty defective, and you can go to the applicant, but it's really quite onerous on the objector, whereas that information should be quite readily available from the council.
Do you know, just for our area, GEKCO and myself and a few other communities, we contribute to somebody doing that monthly research for us, unless they also happen to have an application in which case they don't tell us, which I'll just notice which is not great. But that's quite a useful service. And you know, if people want to know about those applications that come in, we generally notify our closest group. But please, if you want to be included in that, I think I'm GEKCO, and I certainly would be very happy to notify you of applications in your areas. If you wouldn't mind putting an asterisk perhaps next to your email address when you go out on the registration sheet, and we'll just presume that you want to be included if we get applications that come up in the Government Gazette. And important to keep your eyes open. You know, most people will drive past a sign for maybe 3 weeks. Well, it's not going to be up there for much longer and you're going to miss the opportunity. As soon as you see a sign, go and read it. And take a photograph and circulate it on your local group and ask anybody if they know about it or if they wish to object. It's hugely important to do that.
It's usually 28 days you've got.
Yeah. Yeah, it's not up there for long, and sometimes you have to find them too. But, you know, people who run and walk generally are the people who get them up first.
And how far with the development has been applied for and they started work on it? How far can you, if you put an objection on it?
Well, I have to say, just and I don't know, you saying that somebody will apply and they'll start demolishing and doing the whole thing first?
Yeah.
We have a fantastic department in the council.
Yeah.
And they are the building control, it's a part of building control. Yeah. And if you notify them that there's perhaps a start of an illegal use, or there's a demolition of a building, is there a permit granted, or any of those, they generally will respond quite quickly, and they will go out to look at the property and see if they are doing anything illegal. It's not, you know, if somebody has put in an application and they've demolished a house, they must have a demolition permit. But if they start building something else that doesn't have a building plan, they will certainly be stopped. But they need notification, they need to be notified, and they're pretty effective.
It's called single law enforcement.
I think also one thing you could do is try and build up a rapport with the local planner for your area, because often, particularly over the last couple of years, there's this real remote control stuff. You know, you probably look at Google and decide on all sorts of things, but you don't actually go to the area, you don't understand the nature of the people in the area, you know, you don't have a feeling for the area at all, it's just an image. And a lot of this stuff is really understanding the three-dimensional aspects and how things fit together to determine whether a particular application stuff would be good or bad for the area. So just building up some relationship with them, I think would be beneficial. As we said, the chap who has devised this Precinct Plan, it's not in a controversial area in his view, but he plays a different role in other areas. But in this case, it suits you because he's protective of his plan and sits on the tribunal and all that exciting stuff, and he will try and ensure that that comes to fruition or it's protected. So that's a good thing in that instance. But it isn't generally the case that the planner for the area knows the area anymore, which is a big problem, I think.
We really, in this area, just only have the problem of creep and a small section of the community who want to see change. Most people, and that's what we found in the previous survey, and we want to see if it's the same now, but most people like this lifestyle and want to keep this sort of lifestyle. If you were living in Bryanston right now, you would be, if you knew the policies, you would be a very worried person about your investment in Bryanston in my view right now, and similar areas.
And now that green area that you say they're going to develop on.
This one here, yes.
Now, I mean, how can they do that? I mean,
Well, that's become a presidential project. So some smart person or collective people have got together and worked on the job story and decided with Mr. Ramaphosa saying he needs to have a smart city, and it's pretty difficult to do within Johannesburg. And it would be his legacy. They've said that area is available, whether people living there or not want it. And it's been sold to the president as a smart place to create the next smart city and provide lots of employment. So we've been in touch with the planner. He's a very well thought of planner. They had left quite a few errors, and they had left quite a few significant policy points out related to the environment. And that area is very rich in unique environmental areas. Kristen, I don't know if you want to add something, but sadly it has been accepted as a presidential project. Do you want to add, and perhaps how we've got the boundaries widened along rivers and things like that, just to try and protect what is there? And essentially, there are people who lived in Chartwell and places like that who thought they had the same protections we had.
Well, I mean, there's two sides of it. They did do a public participation over the course of last year, I think. And so they got the policy approved by council, but council put a caveat in that they have to supply all the bulk infrastructure for the entire development before they will approve a single application, because they don't want to see this piecemeal implementation of the infrastructure. So, I mean, in the public meetings recently with the city, they're saying they don't expect this to happen anytime soon, if at all. I mean,
no, but what it does is it effectively decreases values there, because people are not going to invest and spend lots of money in building lovely houses, lovely stables, lovely whatever. It's ultimately going to end up going for land value to developers at some stage. So what they've done is quite, in my view, it's quite negative for values in that area. But it's a fact. That's what's happened, and nobody's particularly concerned about the individual property owner.
but what about like developing of wetlands? I mean, that is, you can't, but it doesn't get
That's right.
the wetland, and it's going to get, so how does that work?
Yes. Yeah.
So basically, you've got all these different layers, and we've already talked about SPLUMA and zoning policies and spatial development frameworks, and there's a whole other set of legislation, and that's environmental legislation, and that comes from the National Environmental Management Act, and they have their own environmental management framework, which they almost see as a layer to the spatial development framework. All of these policies are supposed to fit together, which they do so with questionable accuracy. But
Well, actually, they don't. It's up to the communities to remind the council that there are these other acts that need to be taken into consideration, which is what we've put in the management plan that we've done. But council, I'm afraid.
So for example, in our area, it's in the environmental management framework, it's seen as a special management zone, which is quite unique, because in the province there are 5 special management zones. This is the one in the north of Joburg, there's one in the south of Joburg. Dinneking is one, where they've created a nature reserve. The Crocodile River Reserve is one. So they see that as unique environmental aspects, which require a a closer look when an application comes up. And the only real difference that it makes is that if somebody applies to do something, and it happened with the cycle course here, they need to do a proper environmental study, because it's seen as a special management zone. So you've got to do more studies in order to develop, but then obviously you'd have to fit in with the city's policies, etc. So in that you've got wetlands are protected, and they have a protected buffer zone outside the urban edge, and this is questionable because there used to be an urban edge, but just say for the practical purposes, 50 meters outside the urban edge and 32 meters inside the urban edge. So when GEKCO has been commenting, for example, on River Sands and Helderfontein, those fall inside the urban edge, and there's a 32-meter buffer zone. So they need to appoint their own specialists to study the wetland, demarcate the edge of the wetland, and say from here, 32 meters, no development. And that means no sports fields, no, you're not supposed to do anything within that. It's supposed to be a completely natural area. So it's protected in that.
And those have been taken into consideration in the land sharing plan.
And if you look at the Nodal policy, which is a layer of the Spatial Development Framework, you'll see the wetlands are all shown underneath their development plan. You'll see where the wetlands are, which is quite nice because if you have that link to the Nodal policy, you can zoom into your property and see what are the environmental sensitivities in your area. You can actually see quite a lot of information on that. What are the proposed densities in your area? So there's a blanket density outside the urban edge of no development. But for example, if we move to Crowthorne, which is inside the urban edge, you'll see that different areas of Crowthorne can theoretically support different densities.
And if anybody would like a link to those maps, we can send it out. Everybody put the email address? Yeah, we're very happy to send that out. It's quite useful.
How often are these zones reviewed?
Every 5 years.
Every 5 years. So we've got another 3 years to go.
No. Do you want to talk to that, Steve?
Yeah, you've got, from this point on, they're hoping to have the updated Spatial Development Framework approved this year in July, and then that will start the next 5-year period. So each 5 years they may ask for input, unless they decide that it's, it depends on how compliant they are with the Act, but that seems to be the pattern at the moment.
2 years back, when the talk about roads and everything else, the BRT was the big number which worried us. Has that BRT actually fallen away? Because that would encroach into the green zone.
On the William Nicol was a BRT route, and Oliven, the R55 used to be, but is no longer. But the William Nicol is still seen as a future BRT route, although I'd say long term.
They've got a few they call the corridors of freedom, which wander around and haven't been completed yet.
Just to John Paul, so basically, sorry, Justin, when they were proposing those BRTs,
Some of us know you, but not everybody.
Answer my tech pictures. So I do the biodiversity, the grass cells and that sort of stuff, and then I'm the chairman for Sector 4 Community Precinct Forum for there. They did propose BRTs in our area and through our area, and then they realized to have that extensive investment of the infrastructure to actually have a BRT route put down, have all those stations, have all those stops, run power to them. It's an immense investment for 5 people, 6 people. The amount of plots that we have, the amount of people that would utilize those BRTs, people come along, as we said, there's a line, that looks nice, isn't that pretty? And then they think they chucked there at school, they've done a little bit of highlighting work. But if you go down on the ground, suddenly you realize you drive along and you see huge plots, and you'll have one groom, maybe a domestic, and something that'll use that every second, third hour. So the infrastructure to the BRTs in our area was absolutely scrapped as being non-viable.
Yeah, but Kyalami Corner, for instance, they hung their hat on that.
Yes, and as he said, everybody's saying there's these ghost roads, but this road, because of that, we're going to, what's it, 20, 30, 40, how many years before it happens? So, which is why they're saying now with the future ones, infrastructure first, and then we'll plan, instead of doing it the other way around. Correct.
And then the inclusive living, because when you speak about the transportation systems, that highlighted mark as an example wasn't just put there for the sake of making it look nice. That would have accommodated future inclusive living, where they would have had smaller apartments to sort of integrate into the city. We start focusing on the, what's it, live, work, and play concept within.
Yeah. That's very much the
city living.
Yes, that's right, yes.
So the fact that, let's call it that, Gautrain station is planned at the top of R55 and Summit as an example, would then somehow speak to the city's future plans of that inclusive living, and then reducing the property boundaries, which now would allow possibly higher, more stories instead of two-level buildings to be built. We're now looking perhaps at 3. And then the groomsman all of a sudden now has an apartment to live in and make use of BRT type systems.
Yeah, I think the idea is to create these areas which are viable for transport. So you need numbers. And they do have I thought you were talking initially about inclusionary housing policy,
Yes. So,
which is really to facilitate a range of affordabilities in an area.
yeah.
Most of those are being concentrated in brownfields areas, so established, developed areas where they would like to increase the usage of the infrastructure, the roads, etc., and not expand out this way. But how to train and those BRT types of things should be directly integrated with the spatial planning, which is not the case at the moment. As I think Rosemary suggested, there are a number of silo kind of departments, each doing their own thing with a particular focus, whereas this plan is meant to pull them all together into a kind of coherent and functional thing. But yeah, so until they all start talking together, you're going to get these sectoral plans which aren't integrated with the future spatial aspects of the city.
So Steve, is there an updated map that shows the roads that are actually being built at the moment? Because we know that Allendale is being upgraded,
Yes.
but this map and those lines don't speak to what's actually happening. Is there any such map that we can see?
Rosemary's mentioned the one for Midrand, which is a 1997 plan which preceded all of this stuff. It's still in place on, let's say, with the idea of suburban development all over the show, which is very different to what the new rationale is and the new approach to planning, which is concentration in these nodes. If you look at the plans, there are no roads on them. I mean, you get a vague idea where the road is, but it's not a planned road.
Yeah, but they're busy building the Allendale Road.
It's on
Where
there,
did they
it's
go?
on the plan. It's there, it's there.
On there, but not
It's
on
on
the. If you look at these node review plans, you won't find a future situation depicted on them.
So this is still the de facto plan.
Yes. And it's
That's
on
very
there.
odd.
that doesn't play into.
It doesn't incorporate this because it's done by completely different departments or different entities in fact. That's done by provincial roads.
Yeah, well,
And
those
those-
roads are running right through that green zone.
That's right.
So the
That's
danger
exactly-
that you've both highlighted is if the car train does come through Blue Hill, it puts that whole green zone.
Cuts it in half.
Exactly. That's
Because
what we're
that will
saying. There's
become a
no
node.
communication
Yeah.
between where cities say no infrastructure and province say, well, this has been on the cards for 25 years, as has what they're doing now in Allendale. So we're going to continue to do it. And the two don't join. It's just like Summit Road, north of our area. There's no discussion between transformational planning for Johannesburg and the city of Tshwane and their future planning. So on Summit Road, Tshwane have said, yes, that's all going to be commercial and industrial, apart from the environmental sensitivities. And City of Joburg are saying, well, it's our green zone, so we're right on the edge of it. And we brought that up in the meeting that we had recently with transformational planning. And there seems to be no intent to do that either.
unfortunately.
So it just sounds like we're going to end up in court all the time.
I think it needs to take one kind of proper overview of what, and then to kind of address the thing you can handle, because we've created this monster now. There are expectations all over the show. Within the 16, and Tawny's not small either. You know, they're doing a different thing. If Lenny's doing a different thing, it's all a kind of strange thing, which is not meant to be the case. The uniformity and integrated nature of planning should have stretched over the whole area. There's a national development plan, a provincial one, then you get local or municipal ones. And they're all meant to fit a kind of pattern, but the reality is that they're little satellite entities, and it is a problem.
But as I was told by a senior council official, it will be up to the communities to take us to court and force us to do our job properly.
Because that's what it looks like.
Yeah.
Which means we, sitting here, have to take money out of our pockets to build,
yes,
the legal capacity.
Exactly, except there is some compensation, and that is Baylis recently won a case where they did win when they had to tell the city how to do their job properly, and we got awarded costs. I think we're still waiting for that money to be paid, but we got awarded the costs. So if the city did, if a collective community did say your decisions are wrong based on your own policies, and a judge found that to be correct, you would get a portion of those costs back. But yes, it's a case of if you want to see your area protected and your investments protected, if we don't fight collectively, if we don't show up or object, we're going to get what we deserve by not doing anything, unfortunately.
Can I just make a point? The probability of winning is very, very high.
Yes.
The probability of winning is very, very high.
Well, I think the policies are here, they're there. It's
Yes.
just we just need to help them enforce their own policy.
Yeah.
I get a question very often about the status of the provincial roads. Does anyone want to know what's going on with the K56, or is everybody kind of in the loop in terms of how that's going? Okay. So,
Where is the cake?
okay, let me start with where it is. So, PWB 9, this goes from the Sloane Street overpass, it would become an intersection, runs down Main Road and deviates, and then goes through, this is pretty much where we're sitting right now, near the country base, it's there, and then all the way up to Victoria West, that's the PWB 9. That was a high priority road when the e-tolls started, and this was supposed to be phase 2 of the tolling project. So the e-tolls were supposed to come in, and that was one of the first roads they wanted to build. We can see what's happened with that. So, there was a lot of talk with that around 2010, when the tolling was going to start, and that never happened. Since then, you don't hear people talk about this being built anytime in the foreseeable future. You do hear people saying, well, maybe it'll become a train route, but it's all very theoretical at this stage. And when they publish train maps, they're so high level that you can't actually see. You can see that it links Sunninghill and Blue Hills, but you have no idea how.
What's happening between.
So if you do hear the PWB 9, that's kind of the discussion that goes around that. The PWB 5, this comes from, where's this? Fontaine Road interchange.
I think it's just below.
Is it below? New Road is there, Sam Road is there.
Mm.
And it may have changed, this was from 2008, so it may change slightly, but generally they keep the alignment. So this runs all the way from Tembisa through to Roodepoort sort of area. And so this would cut the area up. So this is, when we talk about the GEKCO Conservancy area, we're talking about this, and it's sort of both of these roads cut it up. And these are high order roads like the N1 major highways. Where they would, these are the off-ramps, so you can't get access onto those roads. The road reserve is protected, and it was talked about a lot when Legal's Equestrian Estate was being developed, when River Sands was going. They were motivated for their position because they were on the PWB 5 road. In terms of the traffic modeling for River Sands, it says that it requires this link to be able to handle the future traffic for Riverstand, Stain City, and all the things that they're planning to do in that area. So you do find it referenced in the traffic studies and on the plans that are presented at council in these tribunal hearings. That being said, the likelihood of any funding for that is next to nil because they would have to be entirely provincially or nationally funded. So that's the PW5, and then the K56 is on the coastal radar. K56, for those who don't know, if you start at Kyalami Corner on Main Road, and then you head out, you just pass Maple, where we turned in here to come in tonight, and then it deviates across through Glenfinnis, through Elderfontein property, and ends up just between the river and Danford Square. There's a road reserve that's proper on that side, but on this side it goes to a number of private properties and homes, and some of these people have been expropriated. There was an EIA process that happened. They got environmental approval in 2016. GEKCO currently has an appeal on the water use license, so there's an outstanding appeal that they have to resolve before they can build it. But nevertheless, they've gone and started paying people out for their properties and surveyed the road.
There was a notice more than 3 weeks back for that road. It sounds like it's about to happen.
They wanted to start this month. They intended to start this month. And they did the tender last year, and then the person somebody got a call and was told that they were disqualified from the tender, and they took the department to court. So there's currently a legal interdict based on the tender process that's stopping that from happening. But I mean, even so, if they were to start in April, some of these people are still living in their homes and haven't even been paid out yet. So they've got to give people a bit of notice. And like I said, there's this water use license appeal that would legally prevent them from building it unless they went ahead in some other manner. So yeah, the K56 you'll hear a lot about because they've approved Elderfontein Township based on an entrance that gets access from the K56. So it's been very much a part of the planning of Elderfontein, Riversands, and some of the other developments in the area.
In spite of the policy saying no infrastructure will be supported.
Yeah, and 2,000 residents saying no. So yeah, there was a large outcry, and if anyone wants more information, you're welcome to talk to me after.
So that peak, that cross there, the big piece.
This one here.
Yes, it's actually this corner.
Yeah, this is an end of country base right here, so it actually goes to
this big open piece of land here.
That's it. Yeah, it runs sort of up Bridle Pass. It's sort of between Bridle Pass and sort of to the right-hand side. If you're going up, you'll see there's a road. Well, not really a road reserve because it's farmland, but there's a wetland that also coincides with the roads. And there's interestingly a wetland that coincides with the PW5 as well. So there are a lot of environmental challenges with all of these roads. They were designed in the 70s before they had environmental legislation, and they didn't even look at the environment. They literally just took lines across.
The problem that I have with people say, no, it's just because you're an environmentalist want you not to build there. But it's also the fact that if you build there, you're going to run into problems. Because of the wet land.
You're quite right. And people are tempted to build houses in the wetland, or certainly in the wetland buffers. And most insurance companies will not insure those properties. And people don't know that.
And I mean, we've seen a number, just this rainy season. There's the one in the dip on Zinnia Road, that one flooded. That was built in the last 5 years. So, yeah, there's the reasons not to build it.
It's not a smart thing to do. It might be a cheapest thing to do, but not in the long run. There must be more questions. Any questions specifically related to the survey?
Yeah, isn't there a national body who knows what they are doing? They can tell it, okay, this is how it's going to be, and that's what we're going to do, and that's it.
Well, I'm sorry our our councillor's gone, because I was hoping he might be able to give us a little bit of hope. But I think, I know, but I'm afraid it's like this through many countries in Africa. You do as a community. Communities in some parts of Africa have become very powerful, and the municipality wouldn't dare go against what the community wants in their area. In Johannesburg, we've been lulled into a false sense of security that people are looking after our interests. They aren't. They aren't.
Absolutely not.
Rosemary, on that survey, do you publish the results of that survey? Do you communicate that back to us?
Yeah, absolutely. Like we did in 2015.
It was before my time. So
okay, all right.
Sorry, I didn't see that.
So we have to declare our own Ukraine.
Pretty much, yes. It's just we need a Zelensky as well, and they're just rare.
You look like a good Zelensky. You look like a good Zelensky.
Perfect, thank you, Rosemary.
Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Please